Hey, good morning. I'm Patricia Murphy. It's Tuesday. This is Seattle Now. The Seattle Archdiocese and other local Catholic leaders are suing Washington state officials over a new law that requires clergy members to be mandatory reporters of child abuse. We'll talk with Seattle Times reporter Shauna Sowersby in a minute. But first, let's get you caught up. Speaking of religion, judges on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals are considering today whether Washington state's anti-discrimination law violates the First Amendment. Attorneys representing the Union Gospel Mission in Yakima, a Christian homeless ministry, argue that Washington's law, which would require the charity to hire LGBTQ+ people and others who don't share the same religious beliefs, is a violation of the First Amendment. You can watch the Ninth Circuit live starting at 9:30. Leaders from local public media will be at the University of Washington tonight to discuss current threats from the Trump administration. The administration has directed the Corporation for Public Broadcasting to cease funding to public media stations across the country. Tonight, leaders from KUOW, KNKX, Cascade Public Media, and the Center for Media and Democracy will discuss the future of public service journalism. It all gets started at 5 o'clock on the UW campus at Mary Gates Hall. And hey, it is never too soon to start thinking about the weekend. Why not consider the Science Fiction and Fantasy Short Film Festival? There'll be screenings, Q&As with filmmakers, and awards. Catch the festival Saturday and Sunday at SIF Uptown. Check back for more headlines on tonight's episode of Seattle Now. Catholic leaders in Seattle and Washington state have filed a federal lawsuit against state officials. They say a newly passed law violates their First Amendment rights. It requires clergy members to report any suspected child abuse, even if that information is revealed during confession.
They say that this puts them in an impossible situation because they either have to violate the seal of confession or they have to go to jail for not reporting this to the police.
That's Seattle Times political reporter Shauna Sowersby, who's been following the twists and turns of this story. Shauna, really appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Let's talk about the key tension here, religious freedom versus the duty to report abuse. What have you learned about what's driving the church and lawmakers on this issue? Because I understand Catholics aren't necessarily aligned.
This has got to be one of the most interesting stories I think I've ever written about, and just the response that I've gotten from readers. I've heard from lifelong Catholics. They are very split on this. There's many who, are in agreement with the new state law. There's many who disagree with the state law, even though they believe in protecting children. The church has kind of said that this will make people not want to confess if it means they would go to jail. I think one of the things that I'd like to note, too, clergy kind of claim that they're being singled out with this law, but I feel like it's important to note that similar laws that govern healthcare professionals, for example, require them to report abuse or neglect, and that trumps HIPAA laws. So sort of similar situation in that fact.
Let's talk about the law that state lawmakers passed this session. What does it do?
Yeah, so this is a law that they've been trying to pass for at least the last 3 years. This is about the third year that they've ran this law. And the new law just adds clergy to a list of other professions, such as healthcare workers and school personnel who are mandated reporters of child abuse and neglect. So this means that clergy are now required by law to report abuse and neglect to the Department of Children, Youth, and Families or to law enforcement. But it does not require them to testify in related court cases.
And Shauna, explain why the Seattle Archdiocese and other clergy members are against this change.
So there's a provision in the new law that they were specifically against, which says that clergy have a duty to report abuse or neglect, even if that was disclosed during confession. So they say that this violates the seal of confession.
So the sacrament of confession or the seal of confession, help listeners understand who may not be Catholic what this sacrament means and what this means in the context of the Catholic Church.
Yeah, so confession is a big deal in Catholicism. If you have sins, you must go and talk to a priest about those. And that is the only way you can be absolved of those sins. And so if people are not able to report those things or talk about them, then they fully cannot be absolved of their sins. Clergy say that this puts them in a really tricky position too, because that means that they either must go to jail over not reporting child abuse or neglect, or they violate confession, and that means they get excommunicated from the church.
That's the sacrament, and they liken this to attorney-client privilege in some cases, yes?
Yes.
Tell me about the legal challenge. Who's involved here? What does the lawsuit claim?
So the lawsuit was filed by several dioceses in the state, including the Seattle Archdiocese, the Spokane Diocese, and Yakima Diocese, filed against Governor Bob Ferguson, Attorney General Nick Brown, and every county prosecutor in the state as well. So the suit claims three things. The law violates clergy's First Amendment right to practice religion without government interference. They've even referred to this as a brazen act of religious discrimination. The suit also says that it violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment in the United States Constitution, which requires states to treat individuals in similar circumstances the same way under law. They also say that it violates a provision in the Washington state constitution that guarantees freedom of conscience in all matters of religious sentiment, belief, and worship.
Even before this lawsuit, Shauna, the Trump administration was getting involved in this law passed by Washington state. Tell us about the Trump administration's role and what could potentially happen there.
Yeah, so right after this law was passed, I believe Governor Ferguson signed it on a Friday, and by Monday, the Department of Justice announced that it was opening an investigation into the new law. They referred to it as an anti-Catholic bias that violates the First Amendment. It's unclear where that investigation stands now. We haven't really heard much about it since then, but it seems to be a bigger part of the Trump administration's war on things that they perceive to be anti-Christian biases.
State leaders have had to respond to this legal challenge. What are they saying?
You know, Bob Ferguson had some pretty strong words last week after the lawsuit was filed. He said that he was disappointed that his church is filing a federal lawsuit to protect individuals who abuse kids. He's also a Catholic. He also has said in the past that he feels like this is really important legislation to protect children.
You also talked to Terrence Carroll, who leads the group Heal Our Church. Please explain that group and its response to this lawsuit.
They are basically just out there to try and reform different parts of the Catholic Church, particularly child abuse is a big issue for them. So Terrence Carroll, he's a retired King County judge, and he's also a lifelong Catholic. And he said he believes this lawsuit is a broader resistance to transparency by the church. He has also said that confession is only one part of the religious doctrine of the Catholic Church, and as such, the protection of children should be prioritized instead. He's also noted, along with several others, that confession in the way that we know it with the Catholic Church is not written in Scripture and was not even required until much later after the church was established. So it's a fairly new concept.
Very interesting. And as we've been talking about, not everybody, even Catholics, are unified in this response. You talked with Catholic leaders opposed to this law about what they think should happen if a priest hears about abuse during confession. If not, tell the police, what do they think should happen there?
Yeah, the answer there and the solution there for them seems to be that there should be some sort of intermediary. You know, if they're hearing something in confession, maybe they approach that person afterwards. Or if they hear from a child in confession who is coming to them, then maybe they go and sort of counsel those folks afterwards. So, you know, instead of going straight to the police, it's trying to assess the situation and figure it out and see what needs to be done and, you know, how serious the situation is.
And again, the Catholic Church has not had a fantastic track record protecting young people from abuse, which for a lot of people might be top of mind when they think about this issue. Could Pope Leo weigh in on this? Could this capture his attention?
Absolutely. And actually, that's a great point. I was going to bring up is that Pope Leo is the only person who could change this. So he could change the rules on confession if he wanted to. The child abuse issue within the church is a really big deal to him. So there isn't anything stopping him from weighing in on this. So we shall see.
Interesting. Very interesting. All right. Before I let you go, what else do our listeners need to know about this issue and where it's headed?
I think it should be pointed out, in all fairness, that the church was fine with the version of this law that did have a carve out for confession in it. So they initially supported it whenever there wasn't a carve out for confession. But now that this part has been added, that's their big hang up on it.
And what happens now, Shauna?
We will have to wait. We have the DOJ investigation kind of hanging over the state now as well, kind of in the crosshairs of the Trump administration. Again, we haven't really heard much back on that yet. And then the lawsuit will just have to play out. I mean, we know that, our state leaders are going to fight against this, but I would not be surprised, considering this is already in a federal court, to see this go further, possibly even up to a U.S. Supreme Court decision.
Shauna Sowersby covers state government for the Seattle Times. Really appreciate it. Thanks so much for your reporting.
Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to Seattle Now. Today's episode was produced by Andy Hurst. It was edited by Caroline Chamberlain Gomez. Our production team includes Vaughn Jones, Brooklyn Jamerson Flowers, and Paige Browning. Greg Kramer does our theme music. Seattle Now and KUOW Public Radio are members of the NPR network. I'm Patricia Murphy. See you soon.